The February cold in Edmonton doesn't ask for permission. It just walks through you. Through the walls, through the windows, through whatever coat you thought was enough. I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot of a Petro-Canada at 11:30 at night, engine running because I couldn't afford to let it die in that temperature, watching the fuel gauge and doing math I didn't want to do. I had $43 in my checking account. I had a savings account with $260,000 in it. I did not tell anyone about the second number. That habit, that particular silence, is the only reason I came out of that year with anything at all. Let me go back to the beginning because the beginning matters more than people usually give it credit for. I grew up in a house that had a clear hierarchy, and I was near the bottom of it, not at the very bottom. That would have been too obvious, too easy to name. I was just below the waterline. My younger brother was the one my parents talked about at dinner parties. He played hockey at a competitive level until he blew out his knee at 16. And even after that, he was still the one they introduced first. My older sister married well, or at least that was how my mother described it. She'd found a man with a trade certification and a house in St. Albert, and in my family, that was the equivalent of a doctorate. And then there was me. Tess. The middle one, the quiet one, the one who'd gone into tech, which nobody really understood, and who wasn't married, which everyone understood too well. I want to be precise about something. My parents weren't cruel in any theatrical way. There was no screaming, no dramatic confrontations. It was quieter than that and somehow worse. It was the way my mother would describe my brother's contract work at the dinner table, and then turn to me and ask if I was still doing the computer thing. It was my father forwarding me job postings for administrative assistant positions because, and I'm quoting directly here, it's stable and you'd have benefits. I was a senior software developer earning $112,000 a year plus equity. I had benefits that would make his head spin. But I hadn't told them that, because I had learned very early that sharing good news in my family had a way of making it disappear. Absorbed, diminished, redirected toward someone else's story. I was living at home because my grandmother was living at home. That was the true reason, and it matters that I say it plainly. My grandmother had moved in with my parents 2 years earlier when her health started declining. And she was the one person in that house who had ever looked at me like I was exactly enough. She had macular degeneration and some early-stage cognitive decline, and she needed someone patient around her. I could work from home. I was the logical choice, and I had chosen it willingly. I paid $600 a month in rent, below market, but my parents had insisted it was fair contribution, and I was there, for her, not for them. What I hadn't told anyone was that I'd been promoted 8 months earlier, senior developer to principal engineer. The salary jump was significant. I'd also sold some RSUs from a previous employer that had vested at a very good time. I wasn't wealthy in any dramatic sense, but I had more money than anyone in my family would have believed possible for someone who did computers. I kept it in a separate account at a credit union they'd never heard of. I drove the same 2015 Civic I'd had since grad school. I wore the same rotation of cardigans. I brought lunch from home. I was invisible in exactly the way I needed to be. The first sign that something had changed came in October, when my sister and her husband announced they were expecting. My mother cried. My father opened the good scotch. My brother called in from Fort McMurray and they put him on speaker and everyone toasted and it was warm and full and I was genuinely happy for my sister. I want to be clear about that. But then my mother said it. She said it lightly, the way she said most things that landed hard. We'll need to rearrange the house. I looked at her over my glass. The nursery, she said. We were thinking the guest room, but it's too small. The space next to the bathroom is really the right size. She paused. Your room, Tess, where would I be? The basement has that finished area. The basement is storage. We could clear it out. It would be cozy. My father nodded along like this was already settled. Like the conversation was a formality. My sister looked at the table. My mother smiled the smile she used when she wanted to indicate that the reasonable thing was obviously the thing she had already decided. I said I would think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, my grandmother held my hand one afternoon and told me, lucidly and clearly, that I was the only one who had ever treated her like a person, and not a problem. That was a Tuesday in November. By Thursday, she'd forgotten the conversation. But I hadn't. I found a fully furnished executive apartment on a month-to-month lease downtown. Corporate housing. The kind companies rent for relocating employees. It was expensive. I didn't care. I signed the lease on a Friday morning before anyone was awake, and I told my parents that evening that I'd be moving out by the end of the month, and that I would still come by to spend time with my grandmother several times a week. My mother's face cycled through several things before settling on something that looked almost like relief. That told me everything I needed to know. I moved out on a Saturday with 2 carloads of my own things. My parents were polite and helpful in a surface way. My father carried boxes. My mother made coffee. Nobody asked where I was going. When I drove away from that house with the second load, I sat in the Civic in the alley for a moment before pulling out, just to notice how I felt. I felt like I'd set down something I'd been carrying so long I'd stopped noticing the weight. Here is where I should tell you about what happened next, because this is the part I didn't see coming. About 6 weeks after I moved out, I got a text from my brother. He was back in the city for a few days and wanted to grab dinner. I said yes. We met at a Vietnamese place on Jasper Avenue that we'd been going to since university. He's not a bad person, my brother. He's just chronically indifferent to anything that isn't directly in front of him. We had pho and talked about hockey and his work up north and his new truck. And then, casually, over the last of the broth, he said, "Did you know Mom and Dad are refinancing the house?" I said I didn't know that. "Yeah, they went to the bank last month." He shrugged. "Apparently they're pulling equity for the renovations, the nursery thing, and also they want to redo the kitchen." I said that made sense. People did that. "Weird thing is," he said, poking at his chopsticks, "the mortgage broker called me about it, asked if I knew your income situation, said your name had come up on some paperwork." I set down my spoon. "My name? Yeah, I told them I didn't know anything." He looked up. "You're not co-signing anything, are you?" "Because I wouldn't." "No," I said. "I'm not." I drove home that night very carefully, the way you drive when your mind is somewhere else entirely. I thought about the paperwork. I thought about my name. I thought about the fact that I had a T4 from the year before that showed a number my parents had never seen. I thought about whether they would have accessed my mail. I still occasionally received things at their address. I hadn't fully updated everything yet. I thought about whether it was possible that they had used my income information, without my knowledge, to qualify for a mortgage product they couldn't otherwise afford. It took me 3 days of research and 1 call to a mortgage broker friend of mine to understand what had likely happened. In Canada, some lenders allow refinancing applications to include household income from all residents. If someone had listed me as a contributing household member and included my income on the application without my authorization, that was fraud. Specifically, it was a form of mortgage fraud, which is a criminal offense under the criminal code. The bank my parents used was a Schedule I chartered bank. This was not a small thing. I did not call my parents. I called a lawyer. Her name isn't important, but she was sharp and calm, and she asked me to bring every piece of documentation I had. I brought my lease, which proved I no longer lived at the property as of the date the application had apparently been submitted. I brought my T4. I brought the text from my brother. She made copies of everything and told me to sit tight and let her make some inquiries. 2 weeks later, she called me back. My income had been listed on a mortgage refinancing application submitted to a federally regulated bank. My address was listed as my parents' home. My employment status was listed as permanent full-time, which was accurate. My income figure was accurate. My consent was not present in any form. This was, she confirmed, actionable. I want to pause here because I know what the easy version of this story would do next. It would go straight to the confrontation, the big scene, the dramatic reveal. But that's not what I did, because that's not what you do when you're dealing with people who will rewrite history in real time. What I did instead was nothing. For 6 weeks, I did nothing visible. I went to visit my grandmother on Tuesdays and Fridays. I brought her the butter tarts she liked from the bakery on 124th Street. I had coffee with my mother in the kitchen while she talked about the nursery paint colors. I smiled and asked appropriate questions and gave away nothing at all. What I was actually doing during those 6 weeks was preparing. My lawyer had made contact with the bank's fraud department through proper channels. An investigation had been opened. That process moves at its own pace, and I was told clearly not to interfere with it. So I didn't. But I did other things. I documented everything. I went back through 3 years of financial interactions with my family, the $600 a month, which I had been e-transferring and had records for. A loan of $4,000 I'd made to my brother 2 years earlier that had never been repaid. A situation which I had discovered in going through old paperwork, where my parents had used a credit card account I'd forgotten I'd added them to as authorized users and had run up $11,000 in charges after I'd moved out without telling me. I canceled the credit card. I sent a formal written request for repayment of the $4,000. I removed myself from every financial instrument I could identify. I did all of this quietly, through letters and account changes, not through conversations. Each action was documented. My lawyer had a copy of everything, then I waited. The call came on a Thursday late in March. It was my mother, which surprised me. I'd expected my father, who usually handled anything that felt official. But it was my mother, and her voice had that particular tight quality it gets when she's frightened but performing calm. She said the bank had contacted them. There was a situation with the refinancing application. She said the word situation the way people say it when they mean catastrophe. She said they needed to talk. I said, okay. Sunday works, Sunday dinner, my parents' kitchen because neutral ground wasn't something my family had ever understood. My father sat at the head of the table like it was a board meeting and opened with a prepared speech about how the mortgage broker had assured them it was standard practice to include all household income and that they hadn't realized I had technically moved out at the time of application and that they were sure we could sort this out as a family. I let him finish. I had a folder. I put it on the table. This is documentation of the application date, I said. This is my signed lease, which predates that application by 6 weeks. This is a letter from my lawyer outlining the bank's position on the matter. This is a summary of the credit card charges made on an account you were authorized users on after I moved out, totaling $11,240. And this is a written request for repayment of the $4,000 I loaned. I looked at my brother, which is now overdue by 22 months. My father looked at the folder. My mother looked at my father. My brother looked at the table. The bank investigation is ongoing, I said. I'm not in a position to interfere with it, and I wouldn't want to. But I am in a position to tell you that I've been advised of my options, and I'll be making decisions that are in my best interest, legally and financially. My father said, Tess, we're your family. I had been waiting for that sentence my entire adult life, not because I wanted to hear it, but because I needed to know what I would feel when I did. What I felt was very little. Something that had been held taut for a long time had simply gone slack. I know, I said. That's why I'm having this conversation in person instead of through my lawyer. My mother started crying. My father tried several angles. The mortgage was already approved. It was done. There was no harm. Surely I wasn't going to pursue this. Surely as a family we could find a way. My brother sat very still and said almost nothing, which I think was the most honest he'd been in years. I listened to all of it. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. When my father had exhausted himself, I said, I'm going to see Grandma now. So went upstairs. My grandmother was having a clear afternoon. She recognized me immediately and held my hand and asked if I'd eaten. I told her I'd be okay. She told me I'd always been the one who kept things together, even when nobody noticed. I don't know if she knew what was happening downstairs. Sometimes I think she knew everything. What came out of the bank investigation over the following 4 months was a formal finding of misrepresentation on a mortgage application. My parents were required to restructure the loan under corrected terms, which raised their monthly payments significantly and eliminated the cash-out component they'd been counting on for the renovations. The kitchen did not get redone. The nursery got painted by my sister's husband over 2 weekends with paint from Home Depot. The credit card matter was resolved through a formal repayment agreement my lawyer drafted. My brother repaid the $4,000 in 2 installments. He has not asked me for money since. I want to tell you about the house, though, because that's the part I keep coming back to. About 4 months after all of this settled, my parents mentioned, through my sister, because that was how they communicated with me now, that they were considering selling the house. The mortgage terms had become difficult. The neighborhood had appreciated significantly. They could sell, pay off the restructured loan, and come out with enough to downsize comfortably. This was the sensible thing to do. They were going to list in the spring. I called a real estate lawyer I'd worked with before. I called my financial advisor. I did the math very carefully over about 2 weeks. The house had 4 bedrooms, a double garage, a finished basement, and was on a quiet street in a neighborhood that had good bones and was starting to gentrify. My parents didn't know what it was worth. Not really. They had gotten one agent's opinion and accepted it. I made a private offer before they listed publicly. It was fair. I had it appraised independently, and I offered the appraised value, which was $14,000 above what they'd been quoted by the agent. I went through my lawyer. The offer came from a numbered company I'd incorporated 8 months earlier for exactly this kind of real estate investment. My parents accepted without knowing who was buying. The possession date was June 15th. The call I made to my mother on June 12th was the most satisfying phone call I have ever made in my life. Not because I gloated. I didn't. Not because I was cruel. I wasn't. It was satisfying because I was simply precise. I introduced myself as the beneficial owner of the numbered company they'd sold to, and I told her that I'd be taking possession on the 15th as scheduled, and that I wanted to make sure the transition was smooth and respectful. I also told her that if she and my father needed time to find a place, I was willing to discuss a short-term rental arrangement at a fair market rate, and that I hoped we could handle this like adults. There was a very long silence. Then my mother said, "You bought our house." "I bought a house," I said. "You sold it." Another silence. "Tess, I'll send the rental agreement to your email if you want the extra month," I said. "Or I can have my lawyer send it, whatever is easier for you." They didn't take the rental arrangement. They moved in with my sister and her husband in St. Albert while they looked for something smaller. My grandmother came with them initially, but she was moved into a memory care facility 3 months later when her decline accelerated. I visit her every week. I bring butter tarts. She doesn't always know my name anymore, but she holds my hand and sometimes she smiles like she does. I rent the house now. It cash flows well. I've done the kitchen renovation myself, spread over a year with a contractor I liked and a budget I controlled. The floors are refinished. The backyard has a garden that the current tenants actually use. Sometimes I drive by and I think about what that house cost me over the years, not in money, but in the quieter currency of being overlooked, managed, minimized. And then I think about compound interest, which is a real thing, and I keep driving. My brother texted me last month. He said he hoped we could get dinner again sometime and that he missed talking to me. I texted back that I'd like that, and I meant it. He's not a villain in this story. Nobody really is, and that's almost the hardest part to sit with. People can diminish you without being monsters. They can take from you without thinking of it as taking. They can build their lives on assumptions about yours without ever asking a single question. And they can do all of this while genuinely believing they love you. I believe my parents love me. I also believe they had no idea who I was. Those two things existed in the same house for 31 years, and I am only now learning how to hold them both without needing to resolve them. I still have the Civic. I bought a condo in the Glenora neighborhood last fall. top floor, south-facing, a view of the river valley that still catches me off guard on clear mornings. I make coffee before my first meeting, and I stand at the window and I look at the city and I think, I built this, not the skyline. Just this life, this particular, quietly solvent, nobody's business but life, that's enough. It turns out that was always enough. I just needed to be the one to decide it.